Stuka Joe here. Today we're going to take a look at Bloody Fields of Mollwitz, published by Strategemata. This is a tactical game for 2 players about the Battle of Mollwitz, which occurred during the First Silesian War on the 10th of April 1741 between Austria and Prussia. We will first take a look at the components and then we will conduct an overview of the rules and how the combat system works. Here we see the box with an illustration of a Prussian charge during the Battle of Mollwitz. We have Frederick of Prussia, Frederick the Great, and the Austrian commander Graf von Neipperg. In the back we can see an illustration of the map, which is basically clear terrain hexes, units and markers, and there's some historical narrative on the battle, and a list of components. Here we see the map. It's a paper map. It is 33 inches by 23 1/4 inches. So it's slightly different than the 22 by 34 inch maps that we are used to here in America. Here we see the terrain key. Not a lot of terrain types. It's clear terrain, most of it. We have 3 elevations, which we will show you in detail. There's some scrub terrain, which is symbolized by the little trees that you see there. There's 1 pond, which covers the hex side. There are minor rivers or small rivers, and there's also streams and roads. Because the field of battle historically was covered with the snow, I believe that the publishers decided to go with very light tones here. And we see 3 elevations which are present in this game. The light brown is level 3, and you see that next to the light brown you will see light green, which is level 2. And we will see some level 1 terrain here. So for example, hex 2211, which is next to this stream, is level 1, but hex 2210 is level 2. And if you go further to the left, hex 2205 is level 3. We see there's various towns to the south, Neudorf, and Mollwitz, which is the town for which the battle is named, appears here in the northern edge of the map. There's also some level 3 terrain there. There's 2 principal roads, one from Mollwitz to Neuburg in the south, and another road that goes to the southeast to the other town in the map, Hermsdorf. And we see there the sole pond that appears in the game that is between 2 hexes. The effects of the different terrain types on movement and combat are summarized on the terrain effect charts that are included with the player aids. Each hex on the map represents 120 meters from side to side. And each turn represents the passage of 30 minutes. Let's take a look at the types of units present in the game. The game includes infantry units like this Prussian infantry battalion, and all infantry units in this game are battalion size. The game also includes cavalry units like this Austrian cavalry squadron, and there are 2 types of cavalry units in the game. Cavalry, which forms in line as signified by the red line beneath the unit ID, and Hussars, like this unit, which are present in a looser formation as signified by the 4 dots below the unit identification. Line cavalry units represent cavalry squadrons, while each Hussar units represents 2 squadrons of Hussars. The game also includes a few artillery counters. Each counter represents approximately 4 guns. And the game also includes leader counters like this Austrian Brigade Leader. Here we see a typical Prussian infantry battalion. At the top we have the unit's identification. That is in a color stripe, and that denotes the unit's brigade designation. Its brigade commander will have the same colored stripe at the top of his counter. The number 1 on the top right corner, it denotes the unit's line or wing designation. This unit belongs to the Prussian 1st Wing. The red line below the unit ID denotes that this unit is in line formation. The number in the red circle is the morale value of this unit. And the 2 numbers below that are the fire modifiers. The number to the left is the infantry fire modifier, and the one to the right is the battalion's artillery fire modifier. A word about firing in this game. Units have modifiers which are applied to the infantry fire table if you're firing with the unit's infantry complement. And in this particular game, we have units like this one that have 2 modifiers, meaning that the unit has obviously its infantry, and it also has battalion artillery attached to it, and that is the +4 that you see to the right. So if you're firing this unit with the infantry, you would apply a -2 modifier, and actually the lesser that you roll on the table, the better the result for the firing unit. So negative modifiers are good for firing units. And if you are firing with the unit's battalion artillery, you would use the +4. Later on, we will see the fields of fire to which these types of fire are applied. Now, if a unit like this infantry unit is routed, or it takes 3 hits during an activation, it is reduced and flipped to its reduced side. And we can see that its reduced side shows a morale of 6, and the fire modifiers have changed. Now the infantry fire modifier, which was a healthy -2, is now -1, and there is no battalion artillery modifier, meaning that it cannot be used. The battalion artillery cannot be used when this unit is reduced. There's also cavalry units in the game, like this Austrian cavalry squadron, and you see that it does not have any fire modifiers. Cavalry units operate differently on attack. They conduct charges, and so the important consideration for cavalry units are its morale value, and this one has a morale of 7. But if it is routed or takes 3 hits of morale, it is flipped to its reduced side, and now the morale is 6. Let's take a look at how morale points are used in this game. This unit has an initial morale strength of 7. Let's say that in one attack, the unit is fired upon and takes a loss of 2 morale points. So its morale now would be 5, and we signify that by placing the 5 morale value marker underneath the unit. It now has a morale level of 5. Let's say that in another activation, this unit with a morale of 5 takes 3 hits on morale, reducing its morale now to 2. So because it took 3 hits on morale, we first reduce the morale of the unit to 2, and we have to flip the unit to its reduced side. So if later the unit recovers morale points, it cannot recover to a level beyond 6. In this game, we also have artillery units. Each artillery unit represents about 4 artillery pieces. The artillery units also have a unit ID, like the number 2 here, and it tells us to which line or wing the unit belongs to. It also shows a morale value here of 7, and there is a number in a square, in this case the 10, which tells us what is the maximum range of this unit. The modifiers that we see underneath the maximum range are modifiers for specific ranges. The leftmost modifier, the -1, is when firing at 1 or 2 hexes away. The +3 is when firing at 3 or 4 hexes away. The +5 when firing at 5 or 6 hexes away. And the +6 when firing at a target which is 7 to 10 hexes away. In this game, there are also counters for leaders, and the topmost leaders in this game are the commanders-in-chief, and that is denoted by 4 stars on the unit's counter. And we see here that in this particular game, the Prussian army has 2 commanders-in-chief in Schwerin and Friedrich, and the Austrians have 1 commander-in-chief, which is von Nieberg. Now we see that there is a number in a red circle that is the morale modifier, the number of morale points that are added to any units stacked with these particular leaders. Also, in the case of the Prussian leaders, we see that they have a number in a blue triangle. And this number represents independence of command, that is, the ability of the leader to change orders. Below commanders-in-chief, we have wing leaders. In the case of this Prussian leader, we see that he is the leader of the 1st Prussian line, and von Rommel is the leader of the right wing of the Austrian army. We see their rank as wing or line leaders, that is 3 stars, the morale modifiers inside a red circle, and the independence factors in a blue triangle. And finally, below wing or line leaders are brigade leaders denoted by 1 star. Here we see at the left a Prussian brigade leader, and to the right an Austrian brigade leader. This game uses a command system which I haven't seen in any other games. Of course, I haven't played many games on this particular era. You see here the units set up in their particular wings, and we see the commanders that command each wing or each brigade. We'll take a look at the Prussians first. We see that there's 2 commanders-in-chief in Schwerin and also Frederick. And then we see the 1st wing commanded by von Kalkenstein here. And he has ratings that we've seen before. He has a independence rating of 5, which is his the ability of changing orders on his own without waiting for an order from one of the commanders-in-chief. This is the morale that he adds to the units he's stacked with. Obviously, this denotes these 3 stars that he is a line or wing commander. And then it tells you he commands the 1st line. Then we have this marker, which is an activation marker, which gives us the initiative rating of von Kalkenstein. So the initiative rating is +2. It is not printed on the counter. And we will see how these activation counters work. And we see that below von Kalkenstein, we have a brigade here commanded by MKF Karl, and another brigade, and you know that it is a brigade commander because it has 1 star by von Gietze. Then we see more units of the first line here, the brigade commanded by Dietrich, and the commander here of the superior commander of Dietrich would be von Marwitz. And we see also here von Schulenberg commands the reserve cavalry. Now the second line is commanded by Dessau. And you see his initiative marker here, and you see the brigades that he also commands. In addition, he commands the brigade of von Bredow. We see here that in addition to the first line, there is the left wing of the Prussian army, commanded here by this von Posada. I don't recall the complete name. And you see it's mostly cavalry. You're going to see that Prussian cavalry is inferior in quality to Austrian cavalry. It has a morale of 5. Austrian cavalry is a morale of 7. Another units that you can activate, we have here the Hussars, and that's signified by the H, and also the artillery, the Prussian artillery. We see the Austrian army, Commander-in-Chief von Nieperg. We have the left wing commanded by von Berlichingen. Then we have the right wing here commanded by von Romer. And you see their respective initiative markers. Von Romer commands a substantial amount of cavalry squadrons, and you see them all here. And you see that the Austrian cavalry has a morale of 7. These units with a star are subject to the momentum rule, which gives them a certain advantage. And we see below the reserve cavalry, and we see 2 brigade commanders here that command those units. So you see that right wing, cavalry right wing, is substantial. And here we see the second line, and the second line has these 2 brigade commanders. The first line has these 2 brigade commanders. So we activate the first line is going to be these units, second line, these units. And then we have the left wing. It's, as we stated, under von Berlichingen and the brigades of Philibert and Birkenfeld. Then we have the Hussars, the Austrian Hussars, activated here using this counter, and the Austrian artillery, which is not as effective as the Prussian artillery. That is basically the orders of battle of both armies in this game. Here we see a typical Prussian battalion. We've already covered the information that is printed on the counter, but not all the information pertaining to this unit is on the counter. This is the infantry formation chart, and it gives us additional information about infantry units. They can be in column formation, in which case their fronts are facing a hexide instead of hex vertex, in line formation as the unit that we just saw, or in square formation denoted by placing a square counter on the unit. Now, each unit has a different movement allowance depending on the formation in which it is. For example, in line formation, Austrian units have 3.5 movement factors and Prussian units 4.5 movement factors. You see that in column, units have more movement points. The Austrians have 9 movement factors and the Prussians 10. And while in square formation, they have the same number of movement points as in line formation. Here we see the cost in movement points to change formation. So if we're going to change from line to column formation, the unit will have to spend half of its movement points. And to change to square formation, the unit, depending on whether it's Austrian or Prussian, will spend 3.5 or 4.5 movement points respectively. And finally, we have the cost and movement points to turn the unit from 60 to 180 degrees if the unit is in column formation. Austrian units pay 1 movement point, Prussians 0, and if in line formation, Austrian units 2, Prussian units 1.5 movement points, and while a unit is in square, it cannot turn at all. So looking back at our Prussian battalion, if it were to turn, let's say, up to 180 degrees, and in this case it turned 180 degrees, the cost would be 1.5 movement points for this Prussian unit. It would still have 3 movement points left to move forward. And in this case, forward means that it could move to one of its frontal hexes. Cavalry units have their own formation chart also, and as you see, cavalry units have much more movement points. And you see again the superiority of Austrian cavalry, 20 movement points in column formation compared to the Prussians' 16, and in line formation, still more movement points, 8 compared to the Prussians' 6. And in square formation, you see that both sides have 10 movement points. Here we see the terrain effects chart. This is the chart of effects of movement. And we see the different kinds of terrain here. On the left side, infantry costs and cavalry costs. And we see that infantry, either in column or line formation, will pay these costs. Sometimes the terrain is forbidden for the unit to enter. We see then the cost for cavalry units. They can be in column, in line, or in skirmish mode. And the cost for artillery units are expressed in this rightmost column. Then we have the terrain effects chart on combat, and we have the effect for infantry fire, artillery fire, infantry melee, and cavalry charge. Now note that these costs of turning 60 to 180 degrees apply to line cavalry here. There's other types of cavalry in this game, like Hussars, which are in a loose formation. And note that units that are in this loose formation do not pay any additional movement points to change facing. Now let's look at how infantry units conduct fire combat. Infantry units have a zone of control, which are the 2 frontal hexes of the unit. In this case, hexes 2420 and 2421. The infantry fire chart is used to resolve infantry fire, what we called in other games ranged fire. Remember that in this game there's also melee combat, but infantry fire is resolved using this chart. And the first thing we consult is the firing unit's morale. So if this unit is firing and it has not lost any morale points, we would consult the 7 row here, and that's the starting point. And next, we would apply the unit's modifier. This unit has an infantry fire modifier of -2. Next, we roll a 10-sided die. In this game, the 0 is a 0, not a 10, so the range is 0 to 9. And let's say that a 2 is rolled, and we apply the -2 modifier. The final result is a 0. And that means that the target unit will lose 2 morale points. Now, if the die roll would have been a 1, the final result would have been -1, and the result here would be a 2. That means that the target suffers a loss of 2 morale points, and the asterisk means that we roll the die once again, and on a roll of 0 to 4, it loses an additional morale point. So let's say we roll a 6, no additional morale points are lost, and only 2 are subtracted. Now, units that receive fire and take losses in morale points may have to retreat, and for that we use this chart here. And the first thing we take into account is the morale of the target unit before it loses any morale points as a result of the attack. And let's say that the defending unit was this Austrian battalion with a morale of 6, and we saw in our example that it took a loss of 2 morale points. So by losing 2 morale points, it now would have a morale of 4, but for purposes of determining if it retreats, we use the morale level before sustaining those 2 morale points. And that is 6. And here we see the number of morale points that would cause the unit to retreat, the minimum. Since the unit received a loss of 2 morale points, that happens to be the minimum to cause that unit to retreat. So that Austrian battalion has to retreat. Now, we've seen that units can be in line formation, like this unit, but also a unit can be in square formation, which is signified by the placement of a square counter on top of the unit. The square counter shows a modifier of +2. So what it actually does is that it modifies the unit's fire by +2. So in this particular case, if this unit were to fire to adjacent hexes, which units in square formation can do, it would fire with a total modifier of 0, -2 for its fire modifier, and then +2 because of the effect of the square formation. Now, here we see an Austrian infantry battalion. It has an infantry fire modifier of -1, and because it is in line formation, it can only fire into these 2 frontal hexes, and we apply that -1 modifier. And as we stated before, if it were instead to use its battalion artillery, it would apply a +4, but it could only fire at these 2 hexes, which are the zones of fire for battalion artillery when it is in line formation. But units can change formation for various purposes. A unit may change formation to this formation, repel attack, in which case, if the unit was to fire into any of these 2 frontal hexes, we apply a +1 to the unit's -1 modifier for a total modifier of +0. But the unit could also fire into one of these 2 rear hexes, in which case there would be a +2 applied to its fire modifier for a total of +1. Now, in addition to the repel attack formation, there is this formation, which is refused left. In this case, if the unit were to fire into these 2 frontal hexes, we apply the +1 and also, of course, always the -1 for a total of +0. And if the unit were to fire into any of the rear hexes, it would be the +2, which is modified by the -1 for a total of +1. But the unit, it could fire at this hex to the left, immediately to its left. That's why it's called refused left, in which case you apply a +2 die roll modifier to its -1 fire modifier for a total of +1. And conversely speaking, there is also this formation, which is refuse right. Again, a +1 would be applied to an attack into any of these 2 hexes, which combined with the -1 die roll modifier is a total of +0, a +2 to any fire into any of these 2 hexes for a total of +1, and a +2 would be applied if the unit is firing into its hex to the right, in which case there would be a total modifier of +1. Now, cavalry units don't have any fire modifiers because they cannot conduct fire. They can only conduct combat, which is known as melee. Now, that doesn't mean that cavalry units don't have a zone of control. They do, and zones of control in this game, it is better to think of them as reaction zones. This cavalry unit has a zone of control that consists of its 2 frontal hexes plus the 3 hexes in front of its frontal hexes. So its zone of control actually consists of 5 hexes. And any enemy unit that enters one of these hexes allows the cavalry unit to react and in some cases conduct a countercharge. Now artillery units have a substantial zone of fire here, and it consists, in the case of this particular unit, of up to 10 hexes away. And we've seen or mentioned that these modifiers apply to specific ranges. The first one is 0 to 2 hexes, the second one 3 to 4 hexes, the third one 5 to 6 hexes, and the last one 7 to 10 hexes. So in the case of this particular Prussian artillery unit, it has a maximum range of 10. And here we see the range of action of this artillery unit. 10 hexes comes up to this row here, so it can fire at any one hex within that range. Let's say that it wants to fire that Austrian cavalry unit, which is 5 hexes away. It would use the +5 modifier on the artillery fire chart. If it is 3 hexes away, it would use the +3. And if 2 hexes away, the -1. Here we see the artillery fire chart, which is much simpler than the infantry fire chart, simply because morale has no effect on the firing unit. Here you calculate the distance, and in our first example, the cavalry unit was 5 hexes away. So here we see what the modified die roll would have to be. With a modified die roll of 2, 2 morale points would be lost. Note that in the case of artillery fire, there are certain modifiers. There's also modifiers for infantry fire, and we can see them here. There's modifiers depending on the terrain the target is in and the target formation. If it is in column, it is more lethal for the target because there will be a -2 die roll modifier. If it is in line formation, there's no adjustment. In skirmish order, there's a +3 because the units are more dispersed, so less damage will occur. If firing at cavalry, there's a -2. Cavalry presents a larger target for the artillery. If firing at a single artillery unit, it is harder to hit. That's why it's just a +4. And the distance modifier is the one on the counter. We saw the modifier on the firing artillery unit, depending on the range. And then finally, if the unit is firing, it should be into a unit's flank or rear, there is a -3 die roll modifier that is advantageous for the firing unit. Now, in conjunction with the infantry fire chart, we have to consult the infantry fire modifiers chart because there are certain modifiers that are applied to the die roll. And we start with the terrain of the target. It can confer a modifier which reduces the effectiveness of the attack, and for that we have to check the terrain effects chart. Also, the target's formation may have an impact on the attack. If it is in line formation, there is no adjustment, but if it is in skirmish order, of course, the target is more dispersed and harder to hit, so there's a +3 die roll modifier. Also, there are modifiers based on the target's type unit modifier. If firing at cavalry, cavalry is easier to hit because it presents a larger target, so there would be a -1. And if firing at a single artillery unit, it would be harder to hit, and that's why there's a +2. In addition, there is a tactical modifier, and that is the modifier that is expressed on the firing counter. In this case, we saw, for example, that this unit, this Prussian unit, has a -2 die roll modifier. So that would be what this particular modifier refers to. And of course, this is at a 1 hex distance, which is the 2 frontal hexes, or depending on the formation, any back or side hex it is firing into. Also, depending on the facing of the target, there are modifiers. If the target is fired into its flank and or rear, there's a -3. And then there's a particular rule that only applies to Prussian infantry units, and it's called fire in advanciering, and that is fire while advancing. The Prussians have an advantage, in which case, if they are moving and firing in the same activation, their fire would be considered simultaneous with the target unit that is firing back at them. Normally, when a unit moves and fires, the unit it is firing into gets to fire first, and we subtract the losses from that fire, and then the attacking unit would be able to fire. But the Prussian military doctrine is reflected in this rule, fire in advanciering. The Prussian units can move and fire, and its fire is considered simultaneous with the fire that they receive from their targets. However, there is a penalty, though. The fire from the Prussians suffers a +1 die roll modifier. Let's say, for example, that it is a Prussian activation and the first line was activated. And this particular Prussian unit, which is in line formation, and it is an infantry unit, has a total of 4.5 movement points. It uses 2 movement points to move 2 hexes adjacent to this Austrian infantry unit. And it entered the zone of control of the Austrian infantry unit. It has to stop. And now the Prussian unit may fire against the Austrian unit. What fire in avancieren means is that the fire of this Prussian unit is considered simultaneous with the fire that is triggered by the unit entering this unit's zone of control. So this unit can fire back, and the fire is considered simultaneous. However, the Prussian unit would get a +1 in the infantry fire table. Now, the other way around, let's say that the Austrian unit, which using line formation has 3.5 movement points available, uses 2 movement points to move adjacent to the Prussian unit entering its zone of control. It has to stop, and that triggers the Prussian unit at firing at the advancing Austrians. In this particular case, we would conduct and apply the results of the Prussian fire, and if it causes, for example, losses in morale points, obviously, then it's going to affect the Austrian attack. The Austrian would attack with less morale points, the attack would not be as strong. So in this case, the fire would not be simultaneous because the Austrians don't have that quality that the Prussians have, which again is called fire in advanciering, which translates into advance fire or firing while advancing. Now, turning our attention back to artillery fire, note that there are 2 categories in the distance column, 1 to 2 hexes, and you see that the effects are quite devastating when you look at the 1 to 2 hex row. The reason for that is that at 1 to 2 hexes, it is assumed that the artillery is firing grape shot, which is a concentrated charge of lead that is being fired. At 3 hexes and further, the unit is firing a regular cannonball, so the fire is not as concentrated as if it were at the 1 to 2 hex range. Let's take a look at how the melee rules apply, zones of control, and interactions between infantry and cavalry. Let's say it's the Prussians' turn, and the first line has been activated for assault. That means that the units of that particular line can move, and then they move one additional hex. So this particular infantry battalion moves one hex, then a second hex, and it has entered one of the hexes in the Austrian unit's zone of control. Remember that cavalry units project the zone of control of the two frontal hexes and then the next three hexes to the front. Because it has entered a zone of control of an enemy unit, the infantry unit must stop. Now the passive player, which is the Austrian player, has to decide whether he will countercharge or withdraw two hexes. If the cavalry decides to withdraw, it has to withdraw two hexes, in which case we move the cavalry unit back two hexes. If the cavalry decides to effect a countercharge, it has to roll one die. And it has to pass a morale check. It has to roll equal or lower than its morale. In this case, in this example, it is 7. So let's say that the roll is a 4, so the cavalry passed its morale check. Now we place a reaction counter on top of the unit. That will receive the counter charge, meaning that it can react and fire in reaction. So now the cavalry unit moves forward one hex, and then during the combat portion of the activation, we will resolve this melee attack or this countercharge of the cavalry unit. Let's say now that we go to that part, the combat phase. We would begin by resolving the reaction fire of the Prussian unit. So the cavalry is in one of the front hexes. This Prussian unit has a modifier of -2. Because it is firing at cavalry, there's an additional -1. So we're now at -3, and there's no additional modifiers. So we see that Prussian morale is 8, which is the best. And now we roll 1d10 and modify the die roll by -3. The roll is a 3 -3 is 0. 3 morale points are lost by the countercharging Austrian unit. So we place a morale marker with the number 4, which is the amount of morale that the unit has left underneath the Austrian cavalry. And because it lost 3 morale points in one activation, the Austrian cavalry is reduced, and we flip it to its reduced side. And it shows a morale of 6, but that's a maximum morale of 6. Now we have to see if that cavalry retreats. And we check the morale of the Austrian unit before subtracting morale points, reducing it for morale points. It was 6, so just with a loss of 2, it has to retreat. The cavalry is retreated 1 hex. And note that this is just one of the possible interactions. In this case, cavalry attacking infantry. We may have other situations where infantry attacks infantry in melee combat, but it's basically the same situation. If you enter a zone of control of an enemy unit, that enemy unit has a chance to react. In the case of cavalry, they can withdraw or countercharge. In the case of infantry, the infantry can fire in reaction. Here we have the game set up for the historical scenario. The Prussian army is entirely on the field. The Austrians, about half of their army. The Prussians, to win an automatic victory, they need one of their units in good order to enter any town space of Mollwitz. Otherwise, the Prussians have to destroy a specific number of Austrian units, otherwise Austria wins the game. In this game, each turn is divided into two-player activations, one for the Austrians, one for the Prussians. So who is subject to activation? Well, each of the armies is divided into infantry lines, cavalry wings, hussars, and artillery. And each one of those groups has what we call here an activation marker. Here we see the activation marker for the Prussian left wing, which is the one here in light green, commanded by von Posadowski. Now, this activation marker shows a +0. That's the initiative rating of von Posadowski. And the way this system works is that in each turn, each player secretly chooses an activation marker. Let's say that the Prussians select this one for the left wing, and each player rolls a die. And let's say that the Prussians rolled a 5. You add the die to the initiative rating, and in the case of the Prussians, it'll be a total of 5. The Austrians select their activation marker and roll their die, and then both players reveal the total of the roll plus the initiative. And let's say that the Prussians had a total of 5 and the Austrians a total of 3. In this case, the Prussians have the higher total, and that means that the Prussian player who has the highest score determines who activates his commander first. Either the Prussian can go first, in which case he would have to reveal that this is the group that will be activated, the left wing, or he can allow his opponent to go first, in which case the Austrians would have to reveal which of their groups will move, and then the Prussian player can reveal which is the group that he will move. And this way the turn progresses with players activating their groups until all groups have been activated or have passed. And in order to easily ascertain which groups of each army have been activated, we are going to use these magnetic pins. I'll put them on top of each group's commander, and when that group is activated, I'll just remove the pin. So you'll know that those groups with pins have not been activated yet. So we see that the Prussian army has the Hussars, which are these 3 units. They are activated as a group. We have the left wing, which we saw already. Then we have the first line, and the first line covers a lot of terrain. It actually is commanded by 2 leaders. One, von Mollwitz, has the right part of the first line, and Kalkestein has the left part of the first line. I'm going to put the marker on Kalkestein. So that means that he has not been, the first line has not been activated, and the second line is commanded here by Dessau. The second line has the units spread also, including these cavalry units, as well as the cavalry units that are here behind von Schulenburg. Von Schulenburg commands the right wing, and he also has an activation marker and therefore a pin. And then we have finally the artillery is activated also as a group. So when the artillery is activated, all the artillery units can move or fire. Let's take a look at the initial Austrian forces. The Austrians have 6 Hussar units, and all Hussars are activated as a group. Behind the Hussars is the right wing of the Austrian army. It's composed entirely of cavalry, commanded by von Romer, who is right here. And you see that Nieperg, who is the overall commander, is also present. Now there's units that are off map and will be entering the game since turn 1. And they will enter in column formation. And we have there the left wing of the Austrian army, also entirely cavalry. We have the artillery units, 4 artillery units. We have the first line, which is infantry, but not a lot of infantry. and the second line of the Austrian army. Now, during each turn, starting with turn number 1, we have to roll to see if Frederick leaves the game. Historically, he had to leave the field, but it was midway through the battle. We roll 1d10, and on an 8 or 9, he leaves the field. And remember that in this game, a 0 is a 0. So the range is 0 to 9. So on an 8 or a 9, Frederick leaves the field. Now, to finish the setup, we have to give to each one of these groups, that is the cavalry wings, infantry lines, an order. And in this game, units perform according to orders given to them by the commander-in-chief through the wing commanders or line commanders and brigade commanders. And units have to be in command to function under these orders. There are 3 orders. We have the march order. This order allows units to use their full movement allowance. They can perform fire combat, that is ranged combat, but they cannot initiate melee combat. The exception is cavalry. Cavalry may countercharge, and units with a march order cannot enter hexes adjacent to enemy units. Finally, units with a march order can recover morale by spending movement points. And there's also an assault order. Units under such an order can move freely and can enter hexes adjacent to the enemy, and of course conduct melee combat. And after units spend their movement points, the units must move 1 more hex towards their front unless they have an enemy unit in one of their frontal hexes. Also, infantry units under this order must perform either fire combat, that is ranged combat, or initiate melee combat. And cavalry units can only initiate melee combat, as well as infantry units, if this order is in effect. And under this order, units can recover a maximum of 2 morale points. And the last order is the stop order. And for this order, there is no marker beside the commander of the wing or line. No marker is used. And under the stop order, units may only move 1 hex, and they cannot move out of command. Units can perform fire combat, but they are not allowed to enter into melee combat, and the exception is always cavalry, which may countercharge. So now we will place the initial orders for each one of these groups, and we'll place the order beside the commander of the group. So we'll see that the left wing will have a march order. The first line will be given also a march order, as well as the artillery units. And the second line of Dessau will also have a march order, as well as the right wing. We will leave the Hussars with no marker, so they're under a stop order. On the Austrian side, the Hussars will keep a stop order, so they will have no marker. And the right wing of the Austrian army will be given a march order. As per special scenario rules, the groups of units that start the game off the map will enter the map starting in turn 1 in column formation, that is facing a hex side. And we have to place a march marker for each one of these groups on the map. The marker denotes the hex to which the group will be heading to, and as soon as the frontmost unit of the group reaches that hex, the other units finish their activation, and the group is develops into regular line formation. We flip or rotate the unit to face a hex side, and the unit would be in line formation as the ones that are on the map. So in turn number 1, we see that the Austrians will have units of the first infantry line and the artillery entering through hex 100, and units of the second line entering through hex 200. So we'll place the march markers for the first and second lines here, and you'll see where the units are located, so it'll take them a while to get to those march markers. But while units are in column formation, like the ones that will enter the map, infantry units have 9 movement points, while in line formation it's only 4.5. So we begin the game first by checking if Frederick leaves the field. Historically he did, but once the battle actually started, we roll one die, 1d10, and the die range is 0 to 9. On an 8 or 9, he leaves the field. And the roll is a 2, so he stays for now. And now we start with the special activation of a Prussian group. Afterwards, an Austrian group will be selected also without using the command rules or the activation rules. And then after that, we'll go into a turn where we will use the activation rules, and both sides have to roll after they select a group of units. And the Prussians select the left wing, which is under march orders. And the cavalry units, while in line, Prussian units have 6 movement points, while infantry units have 4.5. And note also that all these units are in command because they are within the range of their leader, von Posadowski. Wing and line commanders have a command range of 5 hexes. Units within that range are in command. And also, by special rule, if a unit is not within those 5 hexes but adjacent to a unit which is connected or in command, that first unit would be in command. So let's see, these are the positions of the left-wing units before movement. And these are the positions after movement, and they are approaching the Kleiner Bach minor river, which is guarded by the Hussars there. So we activated that left wing, so we'll remove this peg to remind us not to activate it again during this turn. Now the Austrians can select a unit, not a unit, a group to enter the game, and it'll select one of these off-board groups. It will be the second line, and it will move using column movement. The units will face a hex side. So these are the position of those units before movement, and these are the positions of the second infantry line after movement. Now we take another turn with 2 activations, but this time the normal activation rules apply. The Prussians have to select a group, and the Austrians another group. Roll 1d10, and the high roller decides which group goes first. So let's say that the Prussians want to activate now their right wing, which is under the command of von Schulenberg, and obviously it has a march order. And von Schulenberg has an initiative rating of 0. The Austrians want to activate their massive right wing under von Romer. And von Romer has an initiative rating of +2. So we roll 1d10 for the Austrians and the Prussians and add the initiative ratings. The Austrians rolled a 0 for a total of 2, and the Prussians rolled a 7 for a total of 7. So the Prussians have the initiative. They can decide either to move first, in which case they would, in a face-to-face game, reveal that it's their right wing they're moving, or they would let the Austrians reveal their group and move first, and that's what they will do. So the Austrians will move their massive right wing, and these are the positions of their units before movement. And these are the positions of the Austrian right wing after movement. We can see that they are attempting some type of outflanking maneuver to cross this minor river in this vicinity and probably advance to the north west of Hermsdorf, in which case they will probably run into the Prussian cavalry of the right wing. And this terrain here includes scrub. Scrub is impassable by cavalry in line formation. So we will change the formation of the right wing to column formation. The chart states that there's no cost in changing to column formation, and now the Prussian cavalry has 16 movement points. This is at the position after movement, still in column formation. Column formation is it's a very vulnerable position to be attacked, but still the Austrians are very far away. Well, and that gives you an idea of the activation system, of how units are activated, rolling a die, comparing initiative, and you have this back and forth between both sides. And of course, in a two-player game, face-to-face game, you don't know the identity of the group of the enemy that is going to move until you reveal the total of the die roll and the initiative. And the game also includes other features we haven't presented here. For example, commanders have the ability to change orders, in which case they have to roll equal or lower than their independence rating. So that's one way that orders can be changed. Commanders that are far away from groups that need to have orders changed, the commanders-in-chief can send dispatch riders also. There's other features that we haven't had the time to speak about. So I hope that this video has given you an idea of the flow of this game and what this game has to offer. This is Stuka Joe signing off for now. Thanks for watching.